Welcome to FP Executive Video. I'm here with Chelsea Willness today. Thank you for coming and joining us.
Thank you.
Chelsea is a professor at the Brock Business School and University of Brock in St. Catharines, Ontario, a very fine part of the country. One of your specialties is corporate social responsibility and recruitment. People who are looking for a job, they look at a company, and they look at the corporate social responsibility, reputation of the firm. Now, your work is very interesting because you found that people value the reputation from a corporate social responsibility point of view of a firm. Can you explain a little bit about how they value this?
Sure. Really what I looked at was how corporate social responsibility forms a part of an organization's image. So it's not the entire part of an image, but an organization can leverage things like social responsibility in forming a positive image with stakeholders in general. And in a recruitment context, obviously the stakeholder we'd be most interested in would be the job applicant. Right. So I was very interested in, can a company's CSR give it a competitive advantage or set it apart from other companies, especially when labor markets are tight and job applicants, or the best and the brightest, are harder to come by. And that was really the context that set the stage for my work, was looking at my interest in sort of labor market shortages, and again, that organizational image. And I think everyone might agree that things like CSR are becoming much more of the sort of social consciousness. Everybody's talking about a firm's environmental policies and practices or community outreach programs. So it's becoming much more almost the normal, the new normal. It's an expectation.
Well, it's interesting because people talk about greenwashing everything.
Sure.
And so I'm interested in some examples that a company, if it's looking at social responsibility, what is it that appeals to folks looking for a job when they look at a company? What in your research really stands out and says, hey, these employees or potential employees saw this firm as being socially responsible?
Sure. Social responsibility is sort of measured by a number of metrics, and there's these sort of third-party ranking systems that are often used as indicators. So things like Fortune 500, there's something called the KLD databases. And typical dimensions might be, again, I mentioned environment and community, but also diversity practices, ethics, and employee relations are sort of the 5 most important to job applicants and the most sort of widely talked about. So organizations might have rankings on those, or you might just even ask people, is this an environmentally friendly company? So those are the most common ways that we might measure CSR, for example, when we're talking about, again, not necessarily financial performance, but attraction of consumers or job applicants.
I see.
So in my research, I actually did split those things up. And with my particular samples, I found that diversity and ethics actually sort of led the pack as most important.
Interesting.
But some of my newest research, actually, with a colleague out of University of Vermont, we're looking more at almost like a personal values matching. So the fit between the person's values and the organization's values. So in the research literature, it's just called person-organization fit. So if I'm high in environmental values, I really value the environment, might I then be more attracted to a company then that espouses good environmental policies and whatnot? And we're finding some evidence for that for sure. So there's some individual differences around which is most important.
But how do firms there's the outside firms that will judge a company's CSR, but how does a firm communicate that social responsibility that it prioritizes? Like, for example, everyone talks about the environment, but you also mentioned diversity. How does a firm, when they're trying to recruit, showcase that aspect of their culture?
You raise a really good point, and one of the most, so let's take diversity for an example. They might just include that in their recruitment information. So if they have brochures or maybe on their website, there's a figure, it's something like 88% of Fortune 500 companies have CSR information on their websites. So companies are promoting it widely. So I guess the first point would be, one way of communicating diversity would be have different looking people in your recruitment materials. That's shown to be attractive to job applicants. So if I'm female or a visible minority, if I see those people reflected in working at this company, that might be attractive to me. But there's some really interesting research both in marketing and in recruitment literatures around cautioning against over-promotion or how that's positioned. So you need to be able to walk the walk as a firm. You mentioned sort of greenwashing. We're a pretty savvy consumer now of that kind of information, and we might become skeptical. It doesn't take much for us to be suspicious of the company's motives. So are they just doing this as a PR exercise, or are they really carrying out these good kinds of activities, community outreach, whatever it might be? So there's sort of a gray area there on how to do it properly, for sure.
I'm interested in if we can just explore diversity for a little bit. I mean, people when they think diversity, they think multi-ethnic and women and men. But what about diversity of ideas? I mean, that's one of the I think the key sort of things that if someone's looking for a job and you're saying, look, I have a very interesting background. I come with experiences in various sectors in my schooling. I want to know if this firm appreciates a diversity of ideas. Is that something that's thought of in the context of CSR, or is it a contributing factor?
I guess my exposure with the CSR, both research and practice, would be that might be less common way of looking at it,
okay.
Especially within that CSR umbrella. I think the most common things that we think of would be community and environment.
Okay.
But certainly diversity has been shown to increase innovation in firms, increase creativity. It reduces something called groupthink, where everybody thinks the same because they all have the same kinds of ideas. And it becomes a more homogenous group that's less creative and less innovative. So there's a lot of support in the research literature for the value of diversity in an organization. There's a very strong business case.
Right.
But again, in my experience in looking at a CSR kind of angle, it's maybe less common.
Now, you mentioned ethics as well, and of course, every firm will argue that, well, of course, we operate ethically. How did job applicants or potential employees in firms look for evidence of ethical behavior?
In my own work, it was pretty general because
Okay.
a lot of the previous literature had used those third-party rankings. So again, I mentioned Fortune 500 or KLD databases, and they would provide that information to job applicants. Here are the ratings of this company. Here's their CSR rating. And in the context of different kinds of studies, now how attracted are you to that firm? And does that kind of ranking information make a difference? So my concern was we're not really asking people, do they even know about these kinds of initiatives without being given these third-party rankings? Does it matter to the individual, my perception of that company and its CSR? So my questions were a little more general, so it would be more along the lines of, is this an ethical company, or this company does business in an ethical manner? So much more general.
So these were, people would have formed their impression basically based on a CSR audit of the firm. But I'm just curious, do employees need to go, or potential employees need to go beyond that, look beyond the third-party information? Are there things that from the employee side you should look at when you go to a company, and from the corporate side as well, in terms of walking the walk, in terms of how they engage employees so that they live up to expectations?
Yeah, you're right. There's a couple of issues happening there. So the first one is in terms of how people access that information. Right. And I think especially in the current economy, a lot of people are arguing, do people really care about CSR anymore? Or are they just looking for a job because they need to put food on the table?
Right.
So there's all kinds of questions around that and where it kind of weighs right now. So people might not be that willing to do a whole lot of extra research into the ethical practices of a company, right? They might be building that image based on other factors or taking it at face value, so to speak. But what you spoke about in terms of employee engagement is a really important part of that too. That even in the current economy, organizations that have better CSR, are more community oriented and have these kinds of programs, it does have a positive impact on the employees as well. So again, after the fact, after you're hired within that company, and we talked a little bit just a minute ago about that sort of skepticism or suspicion and being able to walk the walk. Again, we are a savvy consumer or a job applicant, and we'll know once we get in that firm if our expectations are not met. So I thought that this was the reputation of the company, and now that I'm here inside, I find that they're really not doing that. And that can certainly backfire on the part of the firm. So certainly walking the walk is important.
Interesting. How, I guess the core of your work really speaks to how much weight people put on CSR when they're making a choice of what employer to work for. And I'm curious, how would you weight that? 20%, 30%? How important is it for that? How important is CSR really in terms of hiring?
So in my research, I looked at a couple of different forms of image. I looked at the CSR-related image, so people's impressions of, again, those 5 dimensions that I talked about, and also a more employment-specific kind of image. So I'll be able to use a wide variety of skills at this company. I'll get along with the type of people that work there, or this is a prestigious firm to work for. So a couple different kinds of image. And then also things that are around the job or the organization. So I think the pay is probably favorable. This company has a good location, or there's good opportunities for advancement with this firm. So I kind of had people rate all of those things of the companies they might apply to. And I found that even over and above those sort of heavy hitter kind of attributes like pay and location, that CSR still was a predictor of people's attraction to that firm. And employment related aspects of image that I mentioned were even more so. So, in terms of percentage, I don't have an exact value in that way, but it did predict even over and above those kinds of factors.
Is there any chance that people valued CSR so highly because they felt it was the right thing to do?
Sure.
Is there that possibility that its valuation might have been overvalued because people, sort of assumed that they should do this, they should value it like that's the right thing or a good thing to do?
It's an interesting point. I mean, I guess I didn't really suss that out so much in my study, but I think part of it could be almost an all else equal kind of argument. So this can set your firm apart and give you that competitive advantage. Again, it's a balancing act now because it is sort of an expectation. All stakeholders expect a firm to do things ethically and to have good environmental practices, et cetera, et cetera. So the bar is consistently being raised for companies. And that's where you get into that sort of over-promotion or shotgun approach to just kind of doing everything. And some interesting research, again, in the marketing literature has shown it's quite compelling in terms of that suspicion that we talked about when there's not a match between the cause and the company. So an example that I like to use is Home Depot and their outreach activities with Habitat for Humanity. That makes sense to us, right? Because Home Depot and Habitat, there's building materials at Home Depot and they have these kinds of volunteer.
And Habitat builds houses for
Exactly.
people.
So there's an obvious match there. It makes sense. We believe in Home Depot's initiative there. Now, if they were to sponsor, a run for cancer or an anti-smoking campaign, those are really good causes, but that match is less obvious. And we might think, well, why are they doing that? We might become suspicious that they're just sort of jumping on that bandwagon and it's just a firm serving kind of motivation. They'll get something out of it. So it's just, it's one example with one firm, but there's all kinds of subtleties around how that's leveraged for sure.
So bottom line, if you're a firm, be it big or small, and you're looking to recruit the best candidates, CSR should be prioritized?
I would say it's certainly something that's in that public consciousness. People are very aware of these kinds of policies. Maybe not in all situations, but I mean, in my own work, I had communities, everything from L'Orange, Saskatchewan up north, which is a population that's very, very small, to major urban centers. So there was wide sort of generalizability of the findings and people valued it, kind of regardless in that way. So my recommendation to companies would be at least be conscious of your image in that way. So, promote it appropriately. If you're already doing these kinds of like diversity hiring initiatives, or if you're already doing these kinds of things, let people know. People are accessing your website, put it up there. Let us know what you're doing because it can make the difference for sure.
Chelsea Willness, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks, John. My pleasure.